This week on Jerusalem Dateline, major powers vie for dominance in northeast Syria, as Trump suggests Kurds could flee to oil-rich areas, while Syrian Christians warn Turkey might be planning religious genocide. In Israel, Netanyahu's opponent is given a chance to form a government. Will he succeed where Bibi failed? Plus, love in the face of ISIS, how to pray for the Middle East. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Northeast Syria continues to be the epicenter for historic changes in the Middle East, with the major powers of Russia, Turkey, the Assad regime, and the U.S. all vying for power. Emerging details indicate that President Trump may be directing U.S. troops to stay put in certain areas and enlisting help from the Kurds in the oil-rich region. Even after President Trump announced U.S. troops would leave Syria, the head of the Syrian Democratic Forces said Trump told him they would stay.
Regarding our relations with the U.S., there was a recent call with President Donald Trump, and he confirmed to me that the American troops will stay here for a long time, and that their partnership with the Syrian Democratic Forces will continue for a long time.
The apparent change in U.S. policy encouraged U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham, a vocal critic of the president's decision to leave Syria.
Now, you got a chance here to end this okay. If we can get a safe zone that protects the Kurds from Turkey and vice versa, that would be good. That'd actually be historic. If you can find a way to secure the oil from Iran and ISIS, that's in our national security interest. You got to have a competent force on the ground to make sure that Kurds do not feel abandoned and ISIS doesn't come back. If you do all those things, it ends well. If you don't, it's going to end poorly.
But Trump's call to Muslim and Graham's comment came after Trump also suggested in a tweet that Kurds could move to eastern Syria. This after Turkish President Erdogan and Russian President Putin met to divide northeast Syria. Turkey, Russia, and the Assad regime are beginning to take control of the area formerly patrolled by U.S. forces. Some in the region warn that power shift could have disastrous consequences for the former allies of the U.S., the people who set up an autonomous government in northeast Syria, and for Christians in the area. Earlier, Syrian and Turkish troops displayed flags at what was the Kurdish headquarters. CBN News has learned some experts on the region are concerned the people leading the self-administration government might be arrested, or that there could be retribution and revenge killings by the Assad regime for the people who just 2 weeks ago were the main U.S. allies in the region. But they say it could be averted if the U.S. stays in eastern Syria. On Capitol Hill, there's talk of war crimes by troops allied with Turkey during the invasion.
We would say that Turkish-supported Syrian opposition forces, who were under general Turkish command in at least one instance, did carry out a war crime, and we have reached out to Turkey to demand an explanation.
And if accurate, and I assume that they are accurate, they would be war crimes, as best as I know the law of land warfare.
Earlier at the White House, President Trump declared victory and lifted sanctions on Turkey.
This was an outcome created by us, the United States, and nobody else, no other nation. Very simple. And we're willing to take blame, and we're also willing to take credit.
The president also warned Turkey it needed to protect religious minorities, or he would reimpose sanctions. From inside northeast Syria, Christians issued a stark warning about Turkey.
Turkey is now conducting an ethnic and religious genocide against the people of northeastern Syria, in particular the Christians. Turkey is using the extremist terrorist groups to occupy the Syrian territories. Now, in the region occupied by Turkey, all the Christians, Yazidis, and Kurds fled their homes, and only the radical jihadists are there.
Those extremist terrorist groups the Syriac Christian Union blamed are the Free Syrian Army that Turkey uses as their shock troops. It's a military unit some call ISIS 2.0.
The photographic evidence has emerged that some of the fighters have been positively identified as former ISIS people and former Al-Qaeda people who've just kind of, remustered, so to speak, into this new Turkish-supported formation. There's been evidence has emerged of the soldiers doing ISIS salutes. Some examples even of guys wearing patches and badges of ISIS. It's as clear-cut as that. And certainly, footage emerging of them talking to their phone cameras, so to speak, and then putting it up on the internet, they or their comrades, in which they're, planning, to deal with the apostates and the infidels.
Meanwhile, the humanitarian crisis continues as hundreds of thousands of people forced to flee their homes have no place to go. Just days before, Turkish President Erdogan and Russian President Putin struck a deal to end the Turkish invasion of northeast Syria and find a way to divide the spoils. The decision by President Trump to pull out U.S. forces is likely to have consequences far beyond the Middle East. Presidents Erdogan and Putin set down new guidelines for northeast Syria.
The long-term stabilization of Syria in general can only be achieved, in our opinion, by observing Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
YPG terrorists and their weapons will be removed from 30 kilometers of the Turkish border, and the organization's fortifications and positions will be destroyed.
The deal also allows Turkey to control land it invaded, calls for joint Turkish-Russian patrols, and for the Syrian regime to fill the vacuum of Kurdish-held areas. The deal between Presidents Erdogan and Putin marked the end of an era in northeast Syria and a stunning shift in power to Russia.
It's crucial to note this is Russia, more than any other single country right now, that holds the whip hand in Syria. Putin is effectively kind of the sheriff of Syria right now, and everybody is answerable to him, and that's a result of the rapid U.S. withdrawal that's taken place over the last week.
Syrian Kurds and others in northeast Syria felt betrayed by the U.S. decision and threw rock, shoes, and potatoes at U.S. forces as they left the area. Some are on their way to Iraq, but Iraq's defense minister said those troops will have to leave in 4 weeks. Earlier, President Trump compared the situation to a schoolyard fight.
It's like two kids in a playground. They fight, you let them fight for a minute, and then you pull them apart.
But the fight has left hundreds dead, hundreds of thousands displaced from their homes, and an historic geopolitical shift in the region. On Capitol Hill, both Democrats and Republicans tried to reassert U.S. presence in Syria. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell introduced a resolution opposing the U.S. pullout from Syria and warned the U.S. pullout benefits Russia, Assad, Iran, and ISIS.
A broader approach to America's position in the world, which I think, and 70 senators thought earlier this year, is more forward-leaning, certainly than the decision the administration had made with regard to getting our troops out of eastern Syria.
The pullout has resulted in a loss of U.S. credibility in the region.
We're just not sure how much we can rely on the United States now or in the future. That is a reality on the ground.
We'll have more on the legal aspects of the war in Syria, as well as how to pray for the Middle East later in our show. But first, a shakeup in Israel, as President Reuven Rivlin tasked former military chief and blue and white party leader Benny Gantz with forming the next government. For Gantz, it could be a political mission impossible. The move came after Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu returned the mandate earlier this week after failing to pull together a 61-seat majority of Knesset members for his government. Gantz promised to do what Netanyahu could not.
I promised I would form a united liberal government, and I intend to do so. In the government formed by me, I will serve and act for all Israeli citizens.
But given Israel's divided political landscape, Gantz faces a daunting challenge.
Benny Gantz's party has one more seat than Netanyahu's Likud, but still is far, far away from the majority that he needs. He has to bring together multiple other parties, not one or two, but 5 or 6. Ideologically, they will not sit together. So this is not just a numbers game of reaching a majority, it's also an ideological game, which Netanyahu failed at and which doesn't look like Benny Gantz will be capable of succeeding at.
Gantz has 28 days to form a government. If he fails, it's likely Israelis will head to the polls yet again for the 3rd time in less than a year, possibly next March. Coming up, back in northeast Syria, a story of fighting, miracles, and a plea to the American people from the front lines. As we said earlier, even during the ceasefire, CBN News contributor Chuck Holton says there was still fighting in parts of northeast Syria. He's with the Free Burma Rangers working to help the victims of the war. CBN's Heather Sells has more with Chuck, including the story of God's miraculous protection.
Turkish-backed Syrian fighters are taking control in Serikani right now. That's on the border between Turkey and Syria. CBN News contributor Chuck Holton is there with the Free Burma Rangers, providing medical care to anyone who needs it.
Many of the homes inside Serikani have been set fire to, from what I'm told. We can see the smoke in the distance. There are still sporadic bouts of fighting in this area between the FSA forces and the Syrian Democratic Forces. There are also mortar attacks and bombs from drones being dropped. There are drones overhead from Turkey almost at every moment. It's really changing the way that the people here live. They're afraid to go outside.
Many people are just trying to survive, says Holton. It's tough to even find food.
The supplies have been running out of just about everything because most of the supplies came from Turkey.
People here still can't believe that the U.S. has pulled out of the region. Free Burma Ranger Dave Eubanks is overcome with emotion, caring for the baby of parents who fled.
When I saw this baby, it hits my heart. And you know what people say? They say, "Where's America? Why did you do this? Why did you leave? Why did you leave us?" The Turks, the Free Syrian Army are attacking. ISIS coming up and attacking.
In the midst of the chaos, Holton credits the protection of God for his team's safety.
Just before we got in the vehicles, the gun truck and another machine gun and some dismounted infantry came up on a berm and opened up on us, and it was an absolute miracle that nobody was hurt. I watched a couple of our guys that were up against the berm with bullets ricocheting off the dirt all around them. They were untouched. Our vehicles were untouched, which is unbelievable.
And he's asking for prayer that they'll be useful.
We're not here just to come see the war. We're not tourists. We're here to help.
Heather Sells, CBN News.
As you saw in Chuck Holton's report, he's working with Dave Eubank and the Free Burma Rangers. For the last several years, the Free Burma Rangers have treated the wounded and shared God's love first on the front lines of the battle against ISIS and now on the front lines in this fight against this Turkish invasion. Here's Eubank's description of what's happening there in northeast Syria and his appeal to the American people and how they can make a difference.
Here in northeast Syria, we just came out of Ras Al Ain, Sarikani, where the Turks and Free Syrian Army had pounding and surrounded the Kurds and civilians. We got all the wounded and civilians out, which is a blessing. I thank God for this humanitarian corridor, but now we need to do more. We as a country made a mistake. We lied to the Kurds and we betrayed them. We told them to move their defensive positions and allowed then the Turks and the Free Syrian Army to come in and slaughter them. People have been asking me, why did you leave us? And so my appeal to the American people is this. First, pray. Pray. This world is big enough for everyone to share. There is a way to compromise and find a way. And the U.S. needs to stay here. The U.S. cannot solve the problems of Syria or anywhere else. But right here, we create a space where the Kurds and the Arabs, the Christians and the Yazidis and others can work something out, and they were. There's no guarantee it'll work, but guaranteed it will fail if you leave. And right now, this was an emergent, small democracy of a mixed ethnic religious group that got along with each other. But they needed us in the middle to help hold that together and to keep ISIS down. These people fought and defeated ISIS here, but to keep them from rising again, the U.S. needs to stay. Also, to stop Assad and his dictatorship to taking over this whole country. And the Iranians to come up as well here, which is not their country. So here, we have a chance with only a few soldiers and will to not only be true to our friends, but help people maybe get along. And so my appeal is, America, please come back and stay with what you got. Dave Eubanks, God bless you in Jesus' name.
Up next, who's responsible to help when a genocide is taking place? Is the U.S. obligated to help the Kurds and Christians if Turkey commits genocide? As we've heard, many Christians are fearful that Turkey will commit a religious genocide against them. With U.S. troops still in the area, what would be their legal and moral responsibility or limitations to intervene in that case? I talked with Israeli lawyer David Benjamin earlier about the implications in international law. What is the culpability of U.S. troops if they're close to what could be described as either ethnic cleansing or genocide?
There are actually two questions here. The question is, believe it or not, if it's even legal to use force for the prevention of ethnic cleansing or genocide, because the general principle set out in the UN Charter is that states may not use force in the conduct of their international affairs. That's the general principle. Now, there are exceptions. The one big exception is if you get an authorization from the United Nations Security Council, which will take its decision in the interests of international peace and security. And the other, sometimes a little bit more controversial, is self-defense. So you're entitled to defend yourself even without a UN Security Council authorization if you are under armed attack from another state. Now, what we're talking about here is essentially what's become known as humanitarian intervention. So you're not defending yourself as such. What you're doing is actually intervening on behalf of civilians of another state or of a foreign group. Is that even legal? And actually, the precedents we have for that are quite recent, but they're not to be contained in the so-called black letter law. Of course, if the UN authorizes action, that's fine. But the question is, what if the UN doesn't? And now we have the example of Kosovo, where NATO got involved and unilaterally acted to prevent ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. So there is a precedent. And in the world today, it's generally accepted, certainly from a moral point of view, that that would have been justified. But it's not clear-cut at all if it's even legal.
So it's very unclear legally what, if anything, the U.S. troops, now they have left, but not totally out of Syria, if they see that war crimes and genocide, ethnic cleansing might be undertaken by Turkish troops and their allies. So there is a possibility that they could come back to help.
Well, of course, that's strictly legally, speaking as a lawyer. Of course, there's a question of the moral or ethical obligations, which run far deeper, I think. And I think maybe in certain situations you do the right thing and you worry about, send your lawyers in afterwards to explain why it was legal. I just think that the US, even if it has a very small contingent, can actually pack a very heavy punch. For the simple reason that nobody, at least most states in the world, will not be in a hurry to pick a fight with the US. So they have to realize that they have a very strong leverage, even with a small force in Syria.
Still ahead, love in the face of ISIS. The Bible calls us to do some tough things, such as love our enemies. But what will help us do that? One author says praying for them, and she's taken on a pretty tough case. It's called Love in the Face of ISIS, a book covering 7 prayer strategies for crisis in the Middle East.
In 1 John it says God is love, and so if you substitute God in the face of ISIS, there comes this whole other powerful meaning. But we know that God's heart is for all to be saved. He doesn't wish any to perish.
Author Lorraine Marie Varela and her husband Gabriel lead a ministry called Inspiring Faith International. She says her book is about carrying God's heart into conflict.
Jesus spoke about loving your enemies. What does that look like? It's easy for us to say that when we're sitting in the West, from our comfortable homes and churches, to love our enemies. But when we're confronted with such a violent group, it really changes the dynamics of how we need to respond.
Varela adds that first response must be prayer.
I had a vision of being seated in heaven looking at the earth from God's perspective, and I knew that that was a prayer directive. When we pray, we realign our thoughts and our attitudes, our perspective, our eyesight, our vision with what He's saying and doing. And then we change, and then we come into alignment to release His strategies and directives over a situation.
In her book, she lays out the strategies.
The Lord showed me that through His covenant names, we can release strategy. He's the Lord who is there, first of all. So we want to cover the whole area with His presence. He is the Lord, our provider. There's a need for provision. You know, there's uprising taking place once more, and so as a result, people are being displaced, and women are becoming widowed, and there's a real need for physical sustenance and help. So there were 7 different covenant names of God that he led me through to release his love over the situation, over people.
Those names include the presence, the armies and protection of God, as well as perseverance for the people of God, and provision, healing, and peace of God.
What I love about the book is that 1, it awakens people's hearts for the situation in the Middle East, but 2, it awakens their hearts to what God's purpose is over them and their families and their own life situations. So all of those covenant names of God, they're applicable no matter where you live and what your situation is.
Varela sees it as a boomerang effect.
When we pray for the needs of others, God brings that blessing back to us. And so if I want to pray for his presence to be very real in the Middle East, and I'm dedicating my time to doing that, he's then bringing his presence back on my home and my family.
A film version of the book based on real-life stories is also in development. It will focus on the struggle of 2 Iraqi brothers torn from their family who fall into a gang controlled by ISIS.
The purpose of the film is to bring encounters for Muslim people with the heart of Jesus. And that can happen in a movie theater, that can happen in your home watching the DVD, but it's to bring encounters in his presence, to be real, and for believers to have an awakening of the need to be praying for our brothers and sisters and those in the Middle East, and just to have a heart change.
Varela's plea for prayer is a timely reminder about the current crisis here in the Middle East. Please pray this week for those suffering people caught in the crossfire, and for wisdom for President Trump and other leaders. Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.